This week, we're not just looking at the individual headlines. We're going deeper, we're going to pop the hood, and take a look at the machinery that actually builds those headlines. Let's deconstruct the narrative engine that powered a full week of outrage messaging.
So, if you had to boil down the entire week's message into one single idea, this would be it. A really simple but incredibly powerful two-part story. Infiltration leads to collapse. And this wasn't an accident. This was the central theme that connected dozens of stories and viral clips that on the surface seemed totally unrelated.
So, how is an engine like this actually designed? Well, it all starts with that core infiltration storyline. Let's break down what that really means.
Now, the real key to this whole strategy isn't just focusing on one single threat. It's about fusing them all together. So, immigration isn't just about immigration anymore. It's suddenly linked to sinister foreign influence. Your political opponents aren't just people you disagree with. They're now framed as these internal elites who are actively betraying the nation. The narrative weaves all these different threads into one giant, overwhelming plot that's supposedly aimed at total collapse.
This whole fusion thing is really built on three core pillars. First, you've got a nonstop stream of anti-immigrant outrage. Second, you have the framing of Islam, not just as a religion, but as this unique, civilizational-level threat. And then third, the idea that our own institutions and our own leaders are in on it, that they're the ones enabling it all. The real magic for the narrative is how these three things are constantly blended together until they just feel like different parts of the very same problem.
Right, so an engine needs fuel, and this one is no different. But the fuel mix isn't always the same. Each week you'll see certain themes get amplified, they get escalated, while other themes get turned way down. This is all about keeping the audience's attention exactly where you want it. Let's look at this week's adjustments.
And here, you can see that strategy playing out perfectly. Just look at what got louder. Much harsher rhetoric about Muslims, and way more attacks on the European Union. And now look at what got quieter. That daily drumbeat about economic collapse or the fine details of election mechanics. Now this wasn't random. It's a pretty clear pivot away from economic anxiety and toward threats based on culture and identity, which, let's be honest, often pack a much bigger emotional punch.
A perfect example of this escalation was the constant framing of Europe as a cautionary tale. You heard it over and over again. By claiming that Europe is lost because of immigration, the narrative takes a really complex situation happening overseas and turns it into a simple, terrifying preview of what's supposedly just around the corner at home. It makes the threat feel immediate, personal, and very, very real.
This slide shows you just how fast a pretty radical idea can become, well, normal. On December 2nd, you start hearing demands to get rid of the filibuster. The very next day, those demands are being justified with talk of a mandate. And then, just 2 days later, that extreme phrase, nuke the filibuster, is being tossed around like it's everyday language. This whole process just rapidly shifts the goalposts of what's considered acceptable political talk.
And this week wasn't just about turning up the volume on old ideas. We saw some brand new tactics emerge. There were these accusations of Qatari influence over major media figures. We saw Poland being held up as some kind of purity model. And the EU was reframed not as a political body, but as a direct threat to free speech. And kind of tying it all together was this increase in moralizing language, framing political fights as a literal spiritual warfare.
Okay, so we've seen the design and we've seen the fuel. But what's the whole point? What is this engine's ultimate purpose? Because this messaging strategy is absolutely building toward a very specific goal.
The purpose is a really clear three-step process. First, you sustain emotional pressure. You keep the audience in a constant state of anxiety, always on high alert. Second, you use that anxiety to justify extreme policies. I mean, when you feel like you're living in a permanent crisis, radical solutions start to sound pretty reasonable, right? And third, and this is the most important step, you fuse all the threats into one. The world is a complicated place, but this strategy simplifies it, grooming the audience to stop seeing separate issues and instead see one single unified enemy who's responsible for everything.
And that, right there, is the endgame. To channel all of these different anxieties, all these different fears, and aim them at one single focal point.
So how do they keep the messaging so consistent, so intense? It all comes down to message discipline. You've got tactics like loyalty tests, which you can see playing out in public feuds between influencers. That's all about enforcing purity. Then there's selective virality, where you take one single incident and you magnify it until it feels like absolute proof of a nationwide crisis. And finally, there's just simple, old-fashioned repetition of extreme phrases like Islamic invasion, until over time they start to sound normal.
So once you understand how this engine works, it gives you a pretty good framework for what might be coming down the road. So here are 3 specific signals to really watch for in the coming weeks.
First, keep a close eye on those Qatar influence allegations. Right now, they're mostly contained within certain online circles. The big question is whether they cross that barrier and start getting talked about by mainstream political figures. If they do, that's a major escalation.
Second, watch the language around democratic norms. We saw just how fast that nuke the filibuster idea got normalized. So does that rhetoric now grow into calls for even bigger breaks with our institutions? This will tell us if the target is just one Senate procedure, or if it's the entire system of institutional guardrails itself.
And finally, how is that anti-Muslim framing going to evolve? Narratives like this are never static. They're always adapting. So watch to see if it intensifies or maybe shifts its focus because of new events, either here at home or somewhere else in the world. How it reacts will tell us a whole lot about its resilience and about its ultimate goals.